In this video, we're going to take a look at both variables and scientific questions. So by the end of this video, you are going to be able to determine the independent, the dependent, and control variables in a scientific question. So let's get started. First, let's start with what variables are. A variable is defined as anything that can change. And scientists usually change one variable and then they measure another variable. So, some examples of variables could be things like temperature or growth, rates of change, so rate of speed or rate of melting, or time. So, these are all things that could either be changed or could be measured. Now, let's start with de- uh, defining what the independent variable is, or sometimes we call it the IV. And so the independent variable, or IV, is what you change each time you perform the experiment. You can have only one in an experiment. It's not a good experiment if you have more than one independent variable. So let's take an example. Say, for example, we wanted to study how the volume of water affects the growth of a plant. The volume of water that you add could be an independent variable, and you could measure this in milliliters. So, whenever we talk about independent variables or variables in general, we always define what the variable is as well as the unit of either what we're changing or what we're measuring. The dependent variable, or DV, is what we measure each time we perform the experiment. And again, we can have only one in an experiment. If we are measuring more than one thing, it's not a very good experiment or scientific question that we've set up. So, if we go back to our example, if we're studying the effect of how the volume of water affects the growth of the plant, remember the volume of water was our independent variable. So, as we're adding different volumes of water, our dependent variable, or what we measure, could be the height of plant growth. And we could measure that in units of, say, centimeters. And so, whenever we're defining what our dependent variable is, we always define what it is, as well as the units that we measure it in. Now, we'll get into graphing a little bit more in a future lesson. But just to give you a little bit of a preview, whenever we're graphing variables and we want to look at the relationship between two variables, our independent variable, or what we are changing, always goes on the x axis. And then what we are measuring, our dependent variable, always goes on the y axis. So that's just a little preview, and we'll see more of that later in a future video. Now, the other kind of variable we have are control variables, and these are other things that could affect the experiment. They need to be kept constant because you only want to measure the effect of one thing that could affect the experiment. So everything else should be controlled or should be kept the same. So, for example, in our experiment of looking at how the volume of water affects the height of a plant, we want to think about, well, what else could affect the height of a plant? And so things like the amount or quantity of light that the plant is getting could affect how much it grows. The type of plant we use could affect it, the type of soil we use, or the type of water. And so these are all things that we would want to keep constant or the same in our experiment so that we're sure that only the volume of water is the effect that we are measuring. And there are lots more. So let's now look at an example, another example, so we can pull out what the independent, dependent, and control variables are. In this example, we say 20 people are given the same quantity of toothpaste and are told to brush at the same time for the same length of time each day. 10 of the people ate foods high in sugar, and the other 10 ate foods low in sugar. After 6 months, the number of cavities was determined. So, if we take a look at this, what's changing here is whether the people ate foods high in sugar or whether they ate low in sugar. So, our independent variable then would be the quantity of sugar consumed. And we could quantify this, say, in a mass. Number of grams might be an appropriate unit to use. What we're measuring is after 6 months, we're measuring the number of cavities. And so our dependent variable would be the number of cavities. And finally, some controls are given throughout the question. So, same quantity of toothpaste, same time of day, same length of time each day. And so we could list those ones here. Type of toothpaste is also another one that could be a control variable. Finally, now that we know what variables are, we want to be able to write or identify a scientific question that goes along with our variables. And this usually has the form of how does blank affect blank? And what goes in the blanks in the first one is our independent variable or our IV. So, how does the volume of water, remember, volume of water in our plant example was our independent variable. And then in the second blank goes our dependent variable. So, affect the height of the plant, or because that was our dependent variable in our first example. Or in the example of our toothbrushing folks, how does the quantity of sugar, because that was our independent variable, affect the number of cavities? So you should always use this sentence frame as you're developing your scientific question, always with our independent variable in the first spot here and our dependent variable in the second spot here. That's it then for this lesson. Let's move on to our next task.